Imagine stepping out of a metal landing craft onto a beach made entirely of soft, pitch-black volcanic sand. It is perfectly, terrifyingly quiet. For the past 9 months, American bombers and naval warships have relentlessly pulverized this tiny, 8-square-mile island, dropping thousands upon thousands of tons of explosives in what was the longest and most intense preliminary bombardment in the entire Pacific theater. The military planners in Pearl Harbor had described the beaches as excellent and promised the troops that the thrust inland would be easy. The apparent total lack of a vigorous Japanese response to the massive landings led the United States Navy to confidently conclude that its historic bombardment had effectively wiped out the Japanese defenses. Over 30,000 young Marines crowd onto the shoreline, sinking up to their ankles in the dark, loose ash, waiting for an attack that simply isn't coming. They think they have already won the battle, but beneath their feet, an entire army is waiting in the dark. Suddenly, at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning, the very mountain itself seems to rip open. A ragged rattle of machine gun bullets escalates into a deafening, earth-shattering roar as hidden artillery and heavy mortars rain down on the congested, overcrowded beach. Shells screech and crash. Every hummock spits automatic fire, and the soil underfoot violently erupts with hundreds of exploding landmines. The Americans haven't landed on an abandoned, defeated island. They have walked directly into the most elaborate, perfectly engineered kill zone in modern military history. This was not supposed to happen. American intelligence sources had been absolutely confident that this island would fall in just 1 week. Instead, the United States military was just lured into a 5-week nightmare. How did the most powerful military force on the planet get drawn into such a devastating trap? The answer to that mystery lies in the mind of a brilliantly unorthodox commander, Japanese Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. In June of 1944, he was assigned to command the defense of this tiny, volcanic rock. Kuribayashi was a realist. He knew that if the Americans decided to land on the island, his isolated garrison could not ultimately win the battle. But winning was not his primary objective. His goal was to inflict such catastrophic, unacceptable casualties on the American forces that the United States, along with its British and Australian allies, might reconsider their plans to carry out a full-scale invasion of the Japanese home islands. To achieve this horrifying objective, Kuribayashi broke virtually every rule of traditional Japanese military doctrine. Historically, Japanese forces had established their main defenses right on the beaches to violently contest amphibious landings as they happened, but Kuribayashi abandoned the beaches entirely. He ordered his men to disappear. Using the island's unique volcanic terrain, his troops constructed an impossibly complex system of mutually supporting fortifications, all linked by a vast, labyrinthine tunnel system. By the time the Americans finally invaded on February 19th, 1945, the Japanese had carved out an astonishing 11 miles of deep underground tunnels. They were not preparing to fight on the island. They were preparing to fight inside of it. The sheer scale of this subterranean fortress was mind-boggling. Take the Nanpo Bunker, located deep beneath Airfield No. 2. This command center was buried 90 feet underground, with tunnels running in countless directions. It contained enough food, water, and ammunition for the Japanese soldiers to hold out for 3 solid months. Approximately 500 massive 55-gallon drums filled with water, kerosene, and fuel oil for generators were carefully stored inside the complex. Gasoline-powered generators allowed for radios and lighting to be perfectly operated deep underground, completely immune to the heavy American naval shells raining down above. But the real story of this initial landing is even more shocking. As the Marines desperately tried to push off those lethal beaches, the terrifying reality of the black volcanic ash set in. The Marines were faced with 15-foot-high slopes of soft, shifting black ash. This bizarre terrain allowed for absolutely no secure footing, meaning the heavily burdened Marines could only plod slowly forward as they were chewed to pieces by interlocking fire. Worse still, the soft ash made it impossible to construct foxholes. When a Marine tried to dig into the ground for cover, the ash simply collapsed back in on itself, leaving them completely exposed to the relentless crossfire. Consider the chilling account of 2nd Lieutenant Benjamin Rosell, part of a ground team directing naval gunfire that day. While huddled with his group, a mortar shell suddenly exploded among them. His left foot and ankle hung from his leg, held on by merely a ribbon of flesh. Within minutes, A second round landed near him, and jagged fragments tore deep into his other leg. As he lay there bleeding for nearly an hour, wondering where the next shell would land, a third explosion burst almost on top of him, wounding him severely in the shoulder. Almost immediately after, another blast bounced him several feet into the air, driving hot shards into both of his thighs. When he miraculously lifted his arm to look at his watch, a final mortar shell exploded just feet away, blasting the watch completely off his wrist and tearing a jagged hole in his forearm. He later said that he was finally beginning to know what it must be like to be crucified. The slaughter was absolute. The 25th Marine Regiment's 3rd Battalion had landed approximately 900 men on the island that morning to neutralize fortifications at an area known as the Quarry. By nightfall, Japanese resistance had been so unimaginably fierce that only 150 Marines were left in fighting condition. That is an 83% casualty rate in a single day. Aboard his command ship, Lieutenant General Holland M. Smith stared at the lengthy, horrific casualty reports and muttered to the war correspondents, "I don't know who he is, but the Japanese general running this show is one smart bastard." What happened next changed the way Americans viewed the war forever. If you know anything about World War II history, you have undoubtedly seen the photograph. 6 exhausted Marines straining to raise the American flag atop the rubble-strewn summit of Mount Suribachi. It became the single most recognizable image of the war, a symbol of ultimate triumph, winning the Pulitzer Prize and inspiring the colossal Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington. When the public saw this image, they felt an overwhelming sense of victory and closure. But this iconic photograph is actually hiding a dark, devastating secret. That famous image was captured on February 23rd. That was only the 4th day of the invasion. The battle did not end when that flag went up. In fact, the absolute worst of the fighting was yet to come. The flag was flying high in the sky, but on the ground, the Marines were about to endure another 31 days of pure, unimaginable hell. Mount Suribachi had been effectively cut off above ground, but the Marines knew the volcano was still intricately connected to the rest of the island via the underground tunnel network. A patrol led by First Lieutenant Harold G. Schreer had encountered only a small amount of sniper fire on their way up the mountain to raise the first, smaller flag. Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal, had just landed on the beach below, and upon seeing the colors flying, decided he wanted that flag as a personal souvenir. The battalion commander, believing the flag belonged to the men who bled for it, sent a messenger named René Gagnon up the volcano with a larger replacement flag. It was during this second flag raising that Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal snapped the iconic picture. But the tragedy of this moment is profound. 3 of the 6 men depicted in that glorious photograph, Sergeant Michael Strang, Corporal Harlan Block, and Private First Class Franklin Sousley, were brutally killed in action just days after the photo was taken. And that is where the story takes a truly dangerous turn. The Marines were now facing an enemy they simply could not see. The Japanese crews manning heavy artillery inside the mountain had installed reinforced steel doors over their positions. They would open these massive doors just long enough to fire a devastating volley, and then instantly slam them shut to prevent any counterfire from the Americans. To make matters infinitely worse, almost all of the Japanese bunkers were connected by that elaborate underground maze. American Marines would brutally fight to clear a pillbox using grenades and flamethrowers, only to walk past it and suddenly be shot in the back. The Japanese troops were simply moving through the tunnels deep underground and reoccupying the heavily fortified positions the Americans thought they had already secured. The psychological terror of this ghost war escalated when the sun went down. Similar to previous battles, Japanese soldiers who understood English were deliberately deployed to harass and deceive the Marines. In the pitch black of the island night, English-speaking Japanese troops would crawl out of their tunnels and yell the word "Corpsmen" into the darkness. They were flawlessly pretending to be wounded Americans. Their sole, terrifying objective was to successfully lure United States Navy medical personnel out into the open, only to mercilessly gun them down. How do you defeat an enemy that fights from the shadows, an enemy that cannot be starved out, bombed out, or seen? The Marines learned very quickly that standard-issue firearms were incredibly ineffective against these hardened, subterranean defenses. They were forced to turn to liquid fire. One of the most terrifying technological innovations of the battle was deployed. The Sherman M4A3R3 medium tank, equipped with a massive flamethrower and nicknamed the Zippo, or Ronson tank. These heavily armored beasts proved highly effective at clearing out the hardened bunkers. They were incredibly difficult for the Japanese to disable, forcing the defenders out into the open where they were vulnerable. As the bloody days dragged on, the casualty rates for Marines carrying portable, foot-wielded flamethrowers spiked to a staggering 92%. The troops became entirely dependent on the flame tanks, refusing to advance until one was available. By the end of the campaign, the 5th Marine tanks were expending between 5,000 and 10,000 gallons of thick, burning napalm every single day. But raw firepower alone wasn't enough. The Americans desperately needed flawless, unbreakable communication to coordinate these dangerous strikes without the Japanese intercepting their plans. Early in the war, the United States had been caught totally unprepared, outcoded by Japanese forces who had successfully broken the Pacific Fleet's communication systems. The military needed a secret weapon, and they found it in a group of men who had once been punished for their very identity. Before the war, young Navajo men were sent to strict boarding schools where they were forced to learn English, and if they were ever caught speaking their native Navajo language, they were severely punished. Now, that heavily persecuted language was the absolute key to American survival. 6 Navajo Code Talkers, serving under Major Howard Connor of the 5th Marine Division, were deployed on the Black Beaches. The Navajo language is incredibly challenging for non-native speakers to learn, making it a perfectly secure transmission method. These 6 men worked around the clock without sleep. During the first 2 brutal days of the battle, they transmitted over 800 crucial messages, calling in artillery strikes, reporting troop movements, and directing naval barrages. Out of those 800 rapid-fire communications in the middle of a chaotic war zone, they did not make a single error. Major Connor later famously admitted that, were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken the island. But this was just the beginning of the horror. Despite the incredible bravery of the Marines and the Code Talkers, the battle aggressively bogged down into a grueling, horrific war of attrition. The most arduous task left to the Americans was seizing the Motoyama Plateau in the north, a nightmare landscape filled with obstacles known as Hill 382, Turkey Knob, and the amphitheater. The Marines simply referred to this terrifying area as the meat grinder. Every single American penetration seemed to instantly become a disaster. Units were raked from the flanks, chewed up, and utterly wiped out by interlocking fire. Massive tanks were suddenly hoisted violently into the air on the spouting fireballs of buried landmines. General Kuribayashi had strictly forbidden the massed, suicidal infantry charges known as banzai attacks, considering them a futile waste of his precious manpower. He demanded his men stay hidden and bleed the Americans for every inch. However, on the evening of March 8th, the local Japanese commander of the northern area decided to disobey orders. Captain Samaji Inoue organized a massive, fanatical banzai charge with the wildly optimistic goal of cutting through the American lines and recapturing Mount Suribachi. 1,000 screaming Japanese soldiers charged violently into the American positions. The fighting devolved into savage hand-to-hand combat in the pitch black. By the time the sun rose, the Americans had suffered 347 casualties, including 90 dead. Spread out in front of their lines were the bodies of 784 Japanese soldiers. The sheer loss of life was becoming unfathomable. Out of the 21,000 Japanese soldiers stationed on the island at the beginning of the battle, only 216 were taken prisoner. The rest fought to the absolute death. The island was finally officially declared secure on March 26th, but even that was an illusion. The U.S. Army's 147th Infantry Regiment had to spend the next 3 months locked in a bitter guerrilla war against over 3,000 Japanese holdouts hiding in the surviving caves. They used explosives and flamethrowers to painstakingly dig out the enemy, killing another 1,602 soldiers long after the battle was supposedly won. Incredibly, 2 Japanese soldiers, Yamakage Kofuku and Matsudo Rikyo, managed to survive in those dark tunnels for 4 years, finally surrendering in January of 1949. When the dust finally settled, the final toll sent shockwaves through the American public. The 36-day assault had resulted in over 26,000 American casualties, including nearly 6,800 dead. It stands in history as the only United States Marine battle where total American casualties actually exceeded those of the Japanese, which leads to the biggest, most controversial mystery of all. Why did so many young men have to die for a barren, 8-square-mile rock that smelled of sulfur? For decades, the standard historical narrative has provided a comforting justification. The public was told that capturing the island was absolutely vital because it provided an emergency landing field for heavily damaged B-29 Superfortress bombers returning from dangerous raids over mainland Japan. We are told that taking this island saved the lives of tens of thousands of American airmen. It is an established fact that 2,251 B-29 landings were officially recorded on the island before the war ended. But a shocking modern investigation challenges everything we thought we knew about this historic sacrifice. Marine Captain Robert Burrell, a history instructor at the United States Naval Academy, dug deep into the archives and uncovered a profound contradiction. If you look closely at the data of those 2,251 bomber landings, a massive discrepancy emerges. The emergency landing thesis broadly assumes that every single bomber that landed there was heavily damaged and would have crashed into the ocean, killing its crew if the island hadn't been conquered. However, Burrell's research reveals that of the nearly 2,000 bombers that landed there between May and July of 1945, over 80% of them were stopping for nothing more than routine refueling. Several hundred more landings were strictly for training purposes. Most of the remainder were for relatively minor engine maintenance. In June of 1945, the month that saw the absolute highest number of bomber landings on the island, not a single one of the more than 800 B-29s that landed there did so because of actual combat damage. Furthermore, historical air-sea rescue figures prove that even when bombers were forced to ditch in the ocean, 50% of the crewmen survived. Even the secondary justification, that the island was needed as a base for P-51 Mustang fighters to escort the bombers, proved totally unnecessary. The Japanese interceptor threat had wildly diminished, and the Americans soon switched to nighttime bombing raids anyway, making the fighter escorts practically useless. In fact, only 10 such escort missions were ever successfully flown from the island. As early as April 1945, retired Chief of Naval Operations William V. Pratt boldly stated to the press that the expenditure of manpower to acquire this small, God-forsaken island was highly questionable, completely useless to the Army as a staging base, and useless to the Navy as a fleet base. So why is the emergency landing story so deeply ingrained in our history books? Captain Burrell suggests a deeply emotional, profoundly tragic answer. He argues that this specific justification only became prominent after the Marines had already seized the island and suffered those catastrophic, unprecedented casualties. The tragic, horrific cost of the operation intensely pressured veterans, journalists, and high-ranking commanders to rapidly fixate on the most visible, tangible rationalization they could find for the bloodshed. The undeniable sight of enormous, highly sophisticated B-29 bombers safely landing on the newly captured airfield most clearly linked the brutal island battle to the broader, successful strategic bombing campaign. As the glorious myth surrounding the famous flag-raising photo grew to legendary, untouchable proportions, so too did the emergency landing theory. It was desperately needed to justify why they had to raise that flag in the first place. The men who stormed those black beaches did not choose the target. They were simply handed an impossible task, fighting an invisible enemy hidden deep inside the earth. They faced the horrifying reality of an ash-covered island where there was nowhere to hide, pushing through a subterranean meat grinder that consumed tens of thousands of lives. The agonizing truth is that the greatest testament to the bravery of the United States Marines might actually be found in a battle that, strategically, never truly needed to be fought. Today, the deep volcanic tunnels of the island remain quiet, serving as an eerie, permanent tomb for an army that vanished into the earth, and an eternal, haunting monument to the young men forced to walk through hell to dig them out. This is the clarity of history. This is unsealed,